hopefully brain. We're going to record this so that everybody in the WAFLT universe can watch it. And we want to make sure for people that, they're busy. It's the afternoon. You just probably want to leave your classroom, which I have not done yet. I see some of you are still at school. If you made it home, good job. We have a special guest tonight, a special presenter who is also a WAFLT board member. This is Omar Rachid. He is coming to us from, where do you live, Omar? Because you teach at Lakeside, but do you live in the Seattle area?
Yes, I'm in Seattle.
You're by Ballard, are you not? Somewhere
Yeah,
by. I won't
yeah,
give
not far from where we had PNCFL.
That's right. So, Omar has a wonderful presentation. We'll share this. He's got more than slides that he's going to be sharing. It's a whole folder. So if you have colleagues and they missed the recording or they missed the webinar, we'll have the recording and the materials out by tomorrow, but I might say Friday because tomorrow I am swamped busy with all sorts of cool stuff. So we'll get you going. Thank you, Omar. I'll let you take over. We give a big round of applause to our wonderful presenter taking his time on a wonderful afternoon. Thank you, Omar.
Oh, thank you, Catherine, and really happy to be here with everyone this afternoon. I just love any opportunity I get to share goodies. So I hope to be able to share goodies that take us through all three modes as well as through Spanish and French. I targeted this level for intermediate low and mid, students that are around intermediate low and intermediate mid, working towards intermediate mid and high. And I say both because I've taught it in both Spanish and French, and I have a lot of fun with it. It really shows the different side of students and allows that part to come out that I haven't seen in different units. So I'm just going to share and walk through kind of what I do with this unit, how kind of the outcomes that it showed in classes and some of the reflections that students have shared. And let me drop in the chat, now that everyone is here, the folder that I'll be referencing, unless you did that already, Catherine. Oh, no, there we go. And for those watching this on a recording, you'll also have the link to this folder. So in the folder, you'll find these slides as well as the entire unit in Spanish and the entire unit in French. And if you have any questions about it or any follow-up comments or things like, oh, how did you run this? Because I know that I don't detail everything on the slides, but I just kind of show what I'm going to share with students. I am dropping my email address as well. Just feel free to get in touch. All right, and with that, we're going to get started. I'm Omar Rachid Zaim, and I teach currently just French, but over the past 15 years have fluctuated between Spanish and French, elementary, middle, and high. Elementary and middle school. And I've been in different leadership roles that have allowed me to work a lot with high school students. This is kind of putting together a lot of what I've learned and love about the UN SDGs, and think about how can we get our students from learning and thinking to doing. And just had a lot of fun with this and happy to share it with you this afternoon. The title of the presentation is Advocacy as an Act of Presentational Communication, because when I think about where this unit started, the end goal was action. We spent a lot of time learning and doing and using the language in class, but I wanted to connect it with something that was more meaningful and passionate with our students, because once they find something that they are really holding onto, it just makes the learning a lot more deeper, and they start going down rabbit holes and spending a lot more time things that they should. And that was really encouraging to see. The more time they get to engage in and spend in the language, I count as a success. So that's where it started. And just to frame us for this afternoon, the reason I focused on presentational communication because thinking about what I used to do and what I do now, presentations were conduits for sharing of information in my previous thinking, and now it's not just a sharing of conduit of information, but as a conduit for sharing what steps you can take as a student, as a teen, as a middle schooler, as a high schooler that is looking to be a meaningful part of the world around us. And what we'll get to do this afternoon is really to look at how students are learning how to inform, explain, persuade, and narrate on a variety of topics. I always have the modes and the functions on the back of my mind and back of my head, because this is what we're trying to get them to do. We're trying to get them to use the language in ways that are meaningful and useful. And the how is that they're creating messages for students in their classroom, and I'll include some examples of student work. So it's in the big frame of mind, we're looking through 3 parts, and I just put the session description here because I just want you to retain 3 things right now at this moment. You'll have access to this later. We're going to walk through 3 parts of the unit. And the way I've divided up the unit in 3 parts is we're learning about young activists, or the resources I've used in Spanish and French are youth that change the world. Then we're moving into taking a global view at the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And finally, using the design thinking process to think through a problem that they would like to give their contributions to, learn more about, and propose a potential way to help. And I say propose because that's kind of the end goal of the 3rd part of our unit, is really to look at a proposal. I'm not putting the burdens of a solution on a 12-year-old who is just learning about food insecurity, but I'm looking at ways that they can think about and share about what are their proposals, and validating kind of their thought process and ideas. So that 1, 2, 3 is youth that change the world, UN SDGs, and the design thinking process to look through a proposal for a way to help a global issue. All right, so we're going to step into the first part, which is thinking through youth that changed the world. There's these 2 resources that you'll see in the folder. They're videos, and they're really well done. There's one in French and one in Spanish, and they're maybe about 4 or 5 minutes long. And they present about 5 or 6 different youth, and you'll see some of the names later on, that really changed the world. And the reason I keep using these resources, they're kind of aging out a little bit since many of these youth are no longer youth. But I really wanted to find a connection for them to see people their age, 13, 14, 15 years old, that are making strides, and not something to be kind of aspirational, but something to be more of a tangible in ways that they can see. It's like, hey, this is someone my age that is making a difference because they found something that we're passionate about, and that they really wanted to see a difference in the world around them. A lot of these names you'll recognize. They're, like I said, they may no longer be youth anymore, but at the same time, the times where they were making differences was when they were 13, 14, 15, 16 years old. So that's the kind of mindset that I tried to draw them in. And I'd like to start a lot of the units that are with students working towards intermediate, mid, and intermediate high to practice their narration in a jigsaw type method. So many of us have used jigsaw in different ways. The way I used it here is in a class. They will have there's 5 total youth that change the world in this resource, and I'll have students prepare notes individually first, and then with their shared group of experts. So I say it in that way to build them up and say, well, you 5 are looking at this person. Greta Thunberg is one of them. So you 5 are going to learn really well about her. And in that video, you're going, and through some resources that I curate ahead of time, you're going to answer the 5 W's: who, what, where, when, why. And in thinking about how you're narrating what steps this person took in order to make a difference in their local community or in their global community. So that's the lens that the students are taking in the initial part of the unit. So we go from students in groups are looking at the same person. I let them select and also try to manage the classroom math of, okay, I don't want 90% of the class to be picking the same person, but rather through popsicle sticks or any randomized way, have like 5 or 6 different slots per person, and they can select from the ones that are remaining. So that way, I kind of balance both student choice and an equal amount of a good distribution of students looking at each of these youth. And I know that I'm going way into the weeds of these things, but sometimes I find it helpful to hear how different educators kind of do this in the classroom, so it doesn't just seem like a theoretical approach. So once they have prepared notes, and this takes about 20 or 30 minutes, because as you see in some of these icons below, I have pre-curated an article and a video for each person. So the video that you see here is all 5 or 6, and I say 5 or 6 because I think in the Spanish version I have 5, in the French version I have 6, of different youth that changed the world. And they have individualized slides where there's an article and there's a video, something about that person. And in that group, they'll watch it, they'll read it, and address the 5 W's, or sorry, the 5 W's, so that they can give a clear kind of outlook of that and describe that person well. And then describe and narrating the steps that they took. Like, what are some of the steps that this young activist took? And I tried to provide, I mean, one of the things that I would change and already thinking about changing this for next year is how to provide a little bit more representation. I love these resources, but I also want the representation to reflect my classroom demographics so that they can all see heroes and young heroes from their own cultural background. So that's something that I'm working on. And it comes at a good time because this resource is about 4 or 5 years old now. So I'm looking at ways to kind of update this video. It just works really well. So that's why I hold on to it. So then they get to practice narrating, and especially I like the example of having X Gonzalez too, because it allows us to practice non-binary language in the classroom. So we're looking at ways that they can practice conjugating with gender neutral language as well. So it gives us an authentic opportunity to be able to engage in the classroom, whereas in a way that's not just looking at different conjugations and different adjective endings. I haven't used this in a few years in Spanish. I just wanted to drop that in French for those of you that teach French. As a team, I dropped it in the chat. We use a website on inclusif.fr, and we let our students kind of use this resource when they're writing, when they're speaking. It allows them to look up adjectives, and it will share a variety of ways in which you can use gender neutral language or non-binary language for different adjectives and endings when we don't have them all memorized. As we know, language is evolving. So this is what the first part looks like. This is another example. I have this one in Spanish. So it's same idea. There's an article and there's a video on each of the youth that changed the world.
¿Sabías que una pequeña...
Sorry, I didn't mean to play. And because I just copied them directly from a resource. And you have these resources in the slides, and they're organized in the way that I presented them. Amika George is one that I really enjoyed learning about. She is British, and her major contribution was that thanks to her activism, menstrual products are now free and accessible for free across the entirety of public education in Britain. So that's a really kind of inspirational message for our students to learn about. Didn't find this example in French, but really miss teaching about Amika George. And again, in this focus, so then they go from being in the same group So if I have 5 or 6 students learning about Amica George, and then as part of the next step in the jigsaw, then they are in mixed groups. So it'll be in in groups of 5 or 6, where each one has an individual youth that they became an expert on. And they have a note taker, and that note taker looks exactly in the same way that they prepared their notes. So it's the 5 W's and narration of 3 steps that that person took. So if I am presenting on and learned about Amica George, and I started with a group of 5 or 6 different people, 5 or 6 of my student colleagues and peers that all learned about her, we are practicing our presentations together, we have our notes, we're coordinating together, and then we're split off into randomized groups so that I can share about Amica George to others who haven't learned about her. And when I am learning about Malala Yousafzai, I haven't looked at that video, I haven't read that article resource yet, but I trust that my partner did it well, and I am going to take notes on my note catcher for the 5 W's and 3 steps that that person took. And that's a whole other class. So I mean, throughout these 3 steps, I'm looking at 3 45-minute sessions in class. And I don't know what different schedules look like, but I just wanted to give you an idea of what that looked like in terms of time in the classroom. I just want to take a breathing moment here and ask and see if there's any questions. I was going to check the chat as well. I'll just wait for a few more seconds. Feel free to drop any questions in the chat along the way, or just unmute and share. And I want to make this pause now as I'll be moving into the second part of the unit in just a minute. All right, I think that was appropriate wait time. All right, let's make the transition to the next part of the unit, which is the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. I know that Catherine has led a session on this as well, and looking at ways that we can continue contributing and collaborating so that we can just speak to the nature of how authentic, relevant, useful this tool is as a classroom resource. Especially in the way that they offer authentic resources in the language in the 6 official languages of the UN. So if your language is one of the 6 official languages of the UN, you can find information on all of these United Nations Sustainable Development Goals in the 6 different languages. So I make the transition from Youth That Changed the World to this part of the unit because then it kind of helps put buckets into what they did. So then I make the connection in, all right, what the actions that that person took fall into which of these buckets of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And I make this transition kind of clear because what happens then is that they see, well, Malala Yousafzai was really contributing to 4 and 5. Now, she wasn't just in one bucket. Like our ideas don't exist in just one bucket, and that's kind of why I made that transition clear, because they're interconnected. They are 17 in total, but doesn't mean that they're 17 distinct siloed buckets. When Malala Yousafzai was promoting education for all and equality in the education system in Pakistan, she was looking at access to a quality education, number 4, and goal number 5 about equality between the sexes. And I love this part of the unit because it kind of move into presentational practice as well. When we get into this part of the unit, similarly, oh, Piper, I see that you raised your hand.
I was just curious if your students are, I mean, do you think it's important, or have you discussed what is the UN and what does this mean? de développement durable? I mean, I don't specifically know about this, but I know what the UN is, but I don't know if my students do, you know.
Yes, good question. In the transition to part in this unit, I do two activities that I love that kind of goes with this. I do, you know how we've done, if you ever used this or that in the classroom, it's kind of a true or false, a la this or that. And it's dispelling, there's an article resource that I use called Dispelling Myths of NGOs. And it's included in the PDF as well of the slides. So it's what I do is I present a claim and have students move to one side of the classroom if they think it's true, to the other side of the classroom if they think it's false, and they are supposed to justify their reasoning. So I think this is true because, I think this is false because, and they're practicing with a pair. And then I ask a sample of 2 or 3 students to share their reasoning. And then I have a paragraph, about 4 or 5 sentences that explains whether it's true or whether it's false in that same slide. And so sorry, that was a long answer, but the short answer is yes. And the long answer is I do it in 2 ways. One is through true and false about dispelling myths about NGOs. And then the next is kind of a true and false as well, specifically about the United Nations and its kind of purpose, its goals, and its origins. And absolutely, Catherine, yes. I've benefited from the fact that many of them have seen them before in their humanities, social studies, English classes, in science classes as well in prior years. I forgot to mention that that's really why one of the main reasons why we use this resource is because I can probably count on the fact that many of them have seen it already. And that's a good question to segue into the next part, which is one of the things that I love about presentations is that it allows students to practice higher level language than they couldn't have prepared for in a spontaneous manner. Because they take some time to prepare. They take some time to think about how they want to organize their presentation. I'm giving them feedback along the way. And they get to practice language that's higher than what they can produce in a spontaneous manner. That's why I love using them. One of the things that drive me crazy about presentations is that I don't want to sit and listen to the same thing for a whole class or 2 classes in a row. By the time it's the second to last student, the third last one, we've killed the UN, we've killed the Sustainable Development Goals, and nobody wants to save the world. So the way that I try to balance these is we are just doing 1 or 2 max 3 presentations a day in class, and these are about 2 minutes in length. So for this next part of the unit, my intro, my start to class are student presentations, and I try to schedule 2 over the course of several weeks. And what that allows me to do is different things. Same strategy as before. They kind of pick a sustainable development goal, but I limit to how many can pick that same one so that we're not listening to 15 presentations about poverty reduction. And what they do is that they have scheduled 2 or 3 for several weeks. So we're listening to maximum 2 or 3 students a day. It's my intro to the first 10 minutes of class. And there is a specific way these presentations are organized. What that also allows me to do is to check in with those 2 or 3 students the class before, so that I'm not looking to give feedback on 25 different presentations. I'm giving feedback on 2 or 3 that are presenting the next class. And it helps me kind of keep myself in check. So I'm making this calendar kind of at the beginning of the second part, and I'm looking for these 3 things. In your presentation, there is an initial description of what that sustainable development goal is. Then there are statistics that you'd like to share. And finally, you end with, what can I do? Why am I using these 3 titles for the presentation? I say it's a maximum of 2 minutes. These are also section titles on the UN website. So when I send them to the UN website on your goal, they choose number 3, access to health. there are sections titled description, statistics, and what can I do? And because there's a lot of information on the UN website, and they could spend hours, and I want them to look at the authentic resource in the target language. I don't want them to be looking at something in English. So if they are looking for those 3 titles, it takes them 3 minutes to go to the website, find that sustainable development goal, and look for the sections. And then they're spending, I mean, in those sections, the stats are about 4 or 5 bullet points of statistics. The description is a paragraph about 4 or 5 sentences, and what can I do is a paragraph of 4 or 5 sentences. I have them distill it into about 2 or 3 points, and then they're presenting in front of the class. And we all haven't gotten sick of the sustainable development goals by the end of the unit, because we're taking small doses of these, and we're learning about varied ones. And I schedule them so that we're not listening to the same goal 3 times in a row. What I have really enjoyed about this, so this is just kind of in the beginning part of the lesson. During the lessons, we're actually exploring the different goals. So we're exploring different goals through different interpretive tasks. There are different interpersonal tasks too that I have in the slides that I've shared with you as a PDF. And when I think through what I enjoy doing this unit, it also helps scaffold with different vocab for different of these goals, for different areas in these goals. And I also use different ways to introduce different structures. So we talked about how the youth that changed the world, I asked them for 3 things that they did. Well, I'm helping practice the past tense, but I'm not saying we're going to do an introduction to the past tense. I'm just asking you for 3 steps. What steps did they take? They did this, they spoke, they wrote, they organized, so I'm giving them these language chunks in the past that then they're filling out for the rest of the sentence. And we're not spending a whole classroom lesson on the structure of the past tense, but rather thinking, what are the keywords that you need to be able to describe what they said in the past? Thinking about this presentational task and what we're practicing in these lessons too. Excuse me. And one of the things that I really enjoy about this section is we get to then make predictions about the future. So when thinking about the sustainable development goals, some of the tasks that you'll see in the slides that I've shared in the folder are that we spend some time making predictions. And that's when I get to introduce kind of the differences between making plans and making predictions in the future. And I've used a couple of different strategies that I'd love to share because they end up being really fun. I remember when I was in middle school, I used to read my horoscope almost daily. I remember that I used to open up the newspaper and see what is Aries, what's happening for Aries today. What luck is in store for me. And I believed it. So especially when I've taught Spanish, I've shown videos of Walter Mercado making predictions by horoscope signs. In French, we've read the horoscope. Yes, Catherine, I didn't, fellow Aries. And so use the horoscope to make predictions about the future and see how accurate those predictions are. So I start with something personal and then have them make predictions in turn about the sustainable development goals. So I go from personal to something that's attached to these goals so that we're using these structures and context. That's one way that I've really enjoyed it, just because it brings me a lot of joy. Another way is palm reading. I do admit I have gotten palm reading in the past as well, and really enjoyed learning about my future that way. And I find simple graphics that show the money line, the health line, the love line, and that students are looking at their hands to see how long and how pronounced are the money line, or how long and pronounced is the love line or the health line, and then start making predictions on their future based off of palm readings. And one thing that I share too, I couldn't find it online, but it's something that we used to do. I'm from Venezuela and grew up in Venezuela. My family is from Morocco. So that's where both the French and the Spanish come into play. But in Venezuela as a kid, we used to close up our fists and not counting the lines that close up between the finger and the palm, but counting the lines that happen in between would say how many kids you would have in the future. So that's how we predicted how many kids you would have as an adult. If you make a fist and you look at the side, so without counting the creases made by the palm and my finger, just counting in between those, I can see one. I don't have any kids yet, but I do have 3 dogs, so I don't know where that comes into the equation of fur babies also make it into that prediction. So these, again, fun interactive ways to make it personal, but then move into, okay, so we're back to the Sustainable Development Goals. I've practiced making predictions. We're not doing a lesson on the simple future. We're not making a lesson on the near future. We're doing a lesson on horoscopes, on palm readings, and then into predictions on Sustainable Development Goals and what those will look like in the future. So that's what then the lessons kind of look like after, while the presentations are happening throughout the course of 3 or 4 weeks. I'm just gonna make do a pause right here because this is kind of the second part of the unit. So the first part was Youth That Changed the World. The second part of the unit is looking more broadly at the Sustainable Development Goals, and see if y'all have any questions or any comments or anything you want to share with the group. All right. If anything does pop up, feel free to share in the chat. All right, so we'll move into the third part of the unit, which is I love and have trouble with because it's a little bit too abstract and out of reach sometimes for students. And so here's where I make the balance. One of the things that I've learned about this third part is I'm trying to get them to think into, you're not here to save the world, but you're just here to think about what's a proposal, what's a thing that you could want to share with your classmates, an action that might change, something that you might want to do at home, in your family, at school, and bring it as concrete as possible. I've done this with both 7th graders and 8th graders working towards intermediate mid and intermediate high proficiency. And I don't assess the product because the product looks wildly different for our students. I do assess the process and the reflection at the end. So I just wanted to keep that in mind because, well, easier said than done. Every time I enter this project, I take a deep breath, and every time every iteration of this project has looked differently. I found myself frustrated, but I keep coming back to it because I know it will all be fine in the end, and there will be a lot of growth and development in the language, which is what I'm looking for. But along the way, there's some there's a lot of like, why am I doing this? Why are we doing this again? And double thinking. But I find that in the end, third time in a row, it's the third or fourth time, I can't remember, that I've done this particular unit, and I don't regret it at the end. All right, enough with the negativity on my end, but I'll continue with this last part. So thinking about the design thinking, I have them watch a video about what each of these steps are, and thinking about some matching, some idea with, sorry, I'm going to stay here for a second. That video kind of describes what design thinking is, and I don't ask them to completely understand all the concepts about it. I just want them to be able to recognize what part is empathizing, which part of design thinking is ideation or prototyping or testing. And similarly to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, many of our students have seen design thinking in science classes, in their history classes sometimes, a lot in their tech classes. So for many of them, this won't be the first time that they see it. For many of them, it will be. And I try to not stay hung up on what you need to know what design thinking is. I want them to recognize that there's 5 steps and that they know that we're going to go through this 5-step process. So earlier I said that all I'm looking for this first part, for this part in the unit is that identifying that matching. We watch in Spanish, there's a design thinking process video talking about a city in Arequipa, a city in Peru that used a design thinking process to solve a traffic jam on their main street, Avenida Ejército. In French, there's a resource about how IBM in Morocco is using a design thinking process to automate systems, and they introduce a robot. It's pretty cool. But all I'm looking for them to do in that video is that recall of the 5 steps and identifying when they're talking about this, which step is it? Is it empathizing, defining, ideating, prototyping, or testing? So that kind of makes it accessible because they're not supposed to understand what's the entirety of the video, but through the images and through the language, they can recognize what's happening. And I go out. So, and when I say I go out, I'm trying to make reference to the intercultural communication standards at WAFLT. One of the things that the thing that I most like about them is that they always start with in my own and other cultures. And that allows them to kind of put themselves in a mindset of, I'm not going to go out in the world and go out into another culture and then somehow not really equipped with tools of understanding my own culture. And so we go out first. I showed that example in Peru and in Morocco. And I was teaching in Singapore before. So I used the local example in Singapore about the sustainability gallery. And what I really enjoyed about that part was that this was a mandatory 5th grade field trip for our students. So by the time I was teaching this in middle school, they're talking about their 5th grade field trip memories to going to the sustainable gallery and museum. And here in Seattle, I used an example of Climate Pledge Arena. And how it really, I mean, the design process that it took to go creating and sustaining the Climate Pledge Arena was really a design thinking process. So we look at this a little bit obnoxious influencer and on kind of the pros of Climate Pledge, but it's kind of the video that does not talk about design thinking process. But again, we look at and identifying the design thinking process steps through the Climate Pledge Arena here in Seattle, which again, many of them know and been there, but then end up learning a lot about where the food is sourced, where the water is sourced, where the how they manage transportation, how they try to make, how do they try to reduce their carbon footprint, and all the intentional steps that it took to get there. So I get them in the mindset of, we're going to go through this process. We've looked at an example in a target culture, you're looking at a local example, and now I have a set of slides called my proposal that then they make a copy of. So and it's more in detail. And that's where I'm going to kind of go in a little bit more detail than I have in the previous parts of the unit, because it's a little bit more text dense. But I want to show you how kind of I use it. You'll see me alternating between Spanish and French so that you can see what they look like in the slides. But their whole purpose of this, and again, I'm thinking through what are the modes that I'm practicing. I'm really trying to use advocacy as a tool of presentational communication, as an act of presentational communication, and using the functions of explaining and persuading. So I'm going to explain what that problem is and try to persuade my peers in class what actions and steps they can take. I have these slides, and thinking through, I did copy the PDFs into the Google Drive folder. I'll try and put the slides as well so that you can copy and modify as you wish. I do want to acknowledge that I didn't come up with all of this myself. This was actually a sustainability project that 6th grade students did in English in my previous school. And Darnell Fine, who's an amazing educator and now principal, created these slides in English. And I said, hey, I'm looking for something just like this. And he's like, well, this is what we do in 6th grade. And now that these students are in 8th grade, I was like, okay, well, you know, these slides, they look familiar to you, but now we're doing them in French, or we're doing them in Spanish. And that was a really nice kind of connection to and building them up. You can do this in your first language or your home language, or first language or school language. Now let's do this in our language classroom. in a French language classroom, Spanish language classroom. So each step has a slide where they're thinking through what it is that they're going to do. They're empathizing, what are they going to do to make sure that their proposal is successful. They are going to try and define their goals so that they can think about, what do I want my students, or what do I want my participants or the people who are viewing my proposal to feel, to think, and to do. So there's a lot of structured language here around the that might seem inaccessible, but I always try to bring it down into a very concrete way and saying, what do you want your participants to see, to do, to think, and to feel? And that really gets them thinking outside of themselves. For the ideation step, this is where we spend, I'd say, the biggest chunk of our time between ideation and prototyping. So I'd say empathizing and defining was about 2 classes each. This part will take more about a week, and the next part would take more about a week as well, because this is when we're actually in the doing phase. Earlier, I said that I don't really assess the product, but I assess the process. And what the process at this step looks like is a lot of interpretive tasks and interpersonal tasks. I shouldn't have said a lot, but it just takes, it looks like a processing of a reading, a processing of a video, and interpersonal tasks where they're explaining each step of the way to someone else in class. So the first time that they're practicing isn't at the end when they're presenting, but along the way at each step, they've shared what are your, we do a whole classroom discussion. What are your, and they go around and say, what are you thinking of? What, and they find a connection to something that might be personal to them, and then a connection to a sustainable development goal. So they still have other frames that help them seek language. When they, and only then, when we've had that classroom talk about what is it that you're focusing on, what issue and what sustainable development goal, then I propose, well, I see that Catherine and Piper both really interested in learning about the pink tax and how that affects gender equality. I suggest, do you want to work together? And I say then and only then because, all right, Catherine wants to work with Piper. But I say then and only then because I don't, as we all know, as soon as we say you can work in groups, they're gonna go and find their friends. I don't want them to find their friends. I want them to really find something that's meaningful to them. So I lie the entire time they're asking, can we do this in groups? And I say, no. Until then we have that conversation. Well, there's 2 people that are coalescing. I'm not going to hear 2 competing presentations. I want, they'll work together. And again, it's that product just kind of allows them to join forces and dig even deeper into their interest. So when they are thinking about ideating for their action project, it's really open. I've had students do something as simple as we're doing a Kahoot to have our students learn about this issue. Others created a skit. Others made a poster. Others are thinking about making a mock-up. It's nothing transformational, but it's something that really kind of adapts to their own kind of learning modalities and interests. And I do that in reference that all of these are valid, and you have to show effort in them. You're not just going to turn in a picture or a drawing and say, this is my project. So it's part of this part that I struggle here in the ideating and prototyping is for our students that want to turn in the least amount of work as possible. This is where I kind of grow frustrated because it's a constant kind of back and forth with, I want you to produce something that's meaningful and authentic. And that's where kind of the check-ins are assessments along the way. So the check-ins that I'm doing with them, that's where the assessments are. How much have you produced? What is the language that you're producing? What is that interpersonal or that written output that you're sharing with me about? So thinking in very simple terms, assessing what's on the slides in either a written or a spoken way. And that kind of helps me do checks along the way that I'm not just going to get subpar work towards the end, because that's a real struggle. All right, and then this last part is really their presentations and thinking about a reflection. This is, I will probably spend a one class lesson on this. It's really not that long because we're nearing the end, and these are kind of reflection questions that will lead us to our summative assessment. Summative assessment in our interpersonal, sorry, the presentational task will be assessed on their presentation that they deliver to the class. Interpersonal will be a reflection, and they will do so in pairs or in trios. And the written will be kind of what would they change and what is it that they, what would they change and how do they think their proposal will fare in the future? And what I'm trying to do is in their written, they're practicing their future and their predictions. In my interpersonal, they're thinking about describing their reflections, and in the presentation, they're talking about what they did, so they get to practice different time frames throughout the different modes of the assessment. And this is the part where I get to show you some of the student work. And this is why we do what we do. I love sharing this part. And even though I've given this presentation a couple of times, it's every time I share this part, it just fills me with joy and get a little bit emotional because Clara, who you see in front of you, I've known since she was in 2nd grade, and that was in 7th grade, and she lives with cerebral palsy. And the first day of the project, she was like, I want to teach my classmates what we should do about cerebral palsy and how like to support your peers who have cerebral palsy. And Clara just did an amazing way of communicating, hey, this is what people are going through, and this is how you can support, and these are some actions and steps that you can take. And it was something that these students, I've never seen a group of 35 more attentive 7th graders than I have seen at that presentation. They were captivated by the fact that she was passionate, it was personal, and they've grown up with her, right? They've seen her, they've all been her classmates since she was in 3rd grade. And I mean, she was wheelchair bound for many years, and she still struggled to walk, and is just here delivering a message that's puts everything together. And like I said, I'm not even joking about this, but I wish I could have commanded the room the way she did on that presentation day. I've never seen anything like that. Here's another example of kind of or the product. And again, this was a student who I share this because this is the 2nd year I've had this student and she made strides and changes the 2nd year. The 1st year was a constant battle, didn't want to show up to class, didn't want to be there, didn't want to do any work. And picking up something that she was then kind of passionate about really allowed her to, when I see what she wrote, I mean, she could barely put a phrase together when we were in the 1st year class together. And there was nothing that was really captivating her about class. All she asked me is if I could bring snacks to class. I'm like, that's not my job. And then we like that's not something that's gonna help you grow in the language. But then something changed about her. I'm just cognizant of the time. These 3 girls that you see to the right are 7th graders, and when I was teaching in Singapore, they really were passionate. I shared the example about the pink tax before. They took this project and they went to pharmacies in their neighborhood and they took photos with their phones of the differences in prices for products that were marketed towards girls and women and products that are marketed towards boys and men, and they used their free time to survey 3 different pharmacies. They used their math and they came up with about a 15% difference in prices. And the kids in the room were like, wait, what? I was like, this can't be true. I was like, well, here's a photo. We went to pharmacy A, pharmacy B, pharmacy C, and these are the differences in the same products that are marketed. And again, they were delivering all of this information in Spanish. They tied it to their sustainable development goal. And this was kind of their presentation of sharing. Wasn't a product, wasn't a poster, wasn't something, but rather we went to the pharmacies to see if this was real here, and this is what. And they were like, and then they started talking about their future. They're like, a 15% higher price for me this year than compounding that. I think they were doing compound interest in math. They were like compounding, like this is the difference in what we will pay over a lifetime. And they said in deodorant alone, they're going to be paying $200,000 more in deodorant over their lifetimes than boys. And that really, and I was like, I don't know about that math because I don't know if I'm spending $200,000 on deodorant over the course of my lifetime. I might just stop using deodorant. But this was just another example. I'm looking at the time. I just want to leave some time for talking at the end. This was a student here who was talking about the orca population here in the Puget Sound. Another student's about environmental protection, and another student too. They took more of an academic approach and wanted to do a presentation of their research and their findings. And this last one was a student skit that they talked about how they can talk about CRT, critical race theory, to their students, to their fellow peers, and talk about the impacts of racism in, I don't know why I put environmental protection. It has nothing to do with environmental protection. But it was how they were tying about how racism impacts quality education, and that's how they were tying it to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And I just wanted to end with a couple reflections, as I have done this unit now 3 times. One of the reflection questions I ask students during their summative interpersonal task is, what would you say to someone who asks, why are you studying this in the French class? Why are you studying about this in the Spanish class? And they get fired up, and that's what I'm looking for. They're like, well, because this is important to us. I mean, this is the world we're living in. These are the issues that we're facing. And I was like, exactly. And what else would you say? And then they continue talking about like, well, this is important because this is the issues that are important. I mean, in one way or another, they're saying, this is important to me. It's important to our community. It should be important to many other people. And we need to be talking about these things. And that just kind of helps bring everything together, because at the beginning, it's very me pushing why it's important. And at the end, they're the ones kind of defending why it's important that we keep talking about these things in the classroom. So I kind of inverse the roles and have them kind of be the ones getting in a more role of advocacy. So that's the presentation. Thank you very much for putting up with me for the past 55 minutes. I wanted to leave a few minutes at the end for any questions, and wanted to see if there's any connections or any more observations that you shared. I'm always thinking about next year's unit and thinking of how I can refine it. So any crowdsourcing here would be really helpful. And really appreciative to the WAFLT community. Thank you, Catherine, for organizing these, for our WAFLT board. I've seen them on Zoom and in person, and how much work they do to be able to have our organization be as active as it is. So really just grateful to be part of WAFLT.
Thank you so much, Omar. Could we just all give him that big, big, big hand? And Omar, if you want to stop and stop the screen share just for a moment, we can look at everybody's faces going, oh my gosh. It's because of people like Omar and all of us that we dedicate some extra time. It's May, folks. It's the May. And here we are going, we want to learn more. We want to get ready, because that's what our brains do. We're like, how am I going to make it happen next year? You've had this whole year of teaching and learning and retrying things out, and you're like, now what do I do for next year? And Omar, we are on our heroes or celebrities. Who do we admire and why? And I just added that video because right there, I want the students to not always be thinking influencers, like who's popular, but also who's doing the things. So I will be grabbing several of your ideas off of this and using them probably even this year still. And so many languages can do this, and that's the joy of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. If you haven't seen those and you'd like to learn more about those, maybe we can organize a session at the WAFLT Bi-State Conference that's coming up next October. Just a reminder to everybody that we'll be at the Portland Sheraton Airport. I'm not going to say anything about that, but it's a fine hotel where you can, especially if you live way up north like I do, up in Bellingham, you can just fly on down to Portland. And if you'd like to submit a conference session, or if you'd like to see one, and you could ask a friend, hey, could you present with me? And maybe start that up, because we'll be sending that out pretty soon, hopefully by June 15th, I think. Isn't that right? Like we're saying around June 15th. It's not us, it's COFLT is organizing this year, so we're kind of on the back burner doing the behind the work. We want to just remind you to start thinking about that bi-state conference now, because Oregon somehow thinks we're not coming down. Ha ha ha. Surprise, surprise. Here we come. Yes, Vin.
I just want to say, Omar, this is